It was the perfect summer afternoon in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind where children run free and the air smells of freshly mowed lawns. Jack Walker, a former detective with over a decade of experience, finally had the life he'd dreamed of. After years of sleepless nights working cases, putting in overtime hours, and sacrificing personal time, he had saved enough to purchase his dream home. It wasn't just any home. It was a grand, two-story mansion with a sprawling backyard, a meticulously maintained garden, and a massive pool that glistened like a jewel under the hot sun. As Jack sat on his patio, soaking in the peace and tranquility of his hard-earned oasis, little did he know that his quiet life was about to be shattered. Suddenly, the sound of screeching tires broke through the serenity. 2 police cars whipped into the driveway, their sirens blaring through the neighborhood. The officers stepped out of the car, hands hovering near their belts, as they approached his front gate. "Mr. Walker," one of the officers said, eyeing him closely, "we've received a report of a trespasser. Someone's been seen near your pool area." Jack immediately knew who had made the call. He didn't even have to turn his head. From the corner of his eye, he could see her, Megan Roberts, his nosy neighbor, watching from her window with a smug expression plastered across her face. This wasn't the first time she tried something like this, but what she didn't know was that this would be the last time. 2 months before. Let's rewind a little. 2 months ago, Jack was unloading boxes into his new home. The excitement of a fresh start in a neighborhood that had always been out of reach for him. He'd spent 12 years in law enforcement, and the dream of having a place to call his own in an upscale area had always been a distant hope. But now, with his family settled and his career behind him, it was finally a reality. The previous owners had taken great care of the house. The pool, in particular, had been a selling point. The blue water shimmered like something out of a magazine, and it became Jack's new haven. It was on his first day of unpacking that he first noticed Megan, standing on her porch, staring at him through a set of binoculars like some kind of surveillance expert. "Hello," Jack waved, trying to be friendly. Megan barely acknowledged him, quickly darting behind the curtains. Jack didn't think much of it. But as the days passed, something about her behavior started to raise red flags. He caught her peeking over the fence more than once, her eyes following his every move like she was keeping tabs. Then, one morning, Jack was walking out back to find his neighbor standing on his property, casually sipping a drink by the pool. Megan was in her workout gear, acting as though the pool was hers to enjoy. "Hey, Megan," Jack called, trying to keep his tone calm. "I don't think you're supposed to be here. This is my private property." She turned, feigning surprise. "Oh, I thought you were the maintenance guy. You know, the last owner said I could use the pool whenever I wanted." Jack stood frozen for a moment, fighting the urge to yell. He was calm, collected. Years of detective work taught him how to handle situations like this. "This isn't the last owner's home anymore. It's mine now. Please leave." She laughed it off and strolled out of his backyard, muttering something under her breath about how unreasonable he was being. But that was just the beginning. Megan wasn't the type to back down easily. Over the next few weeks, Megan's behavior became more intrusive. One Saturday morning, Jack woke up to loud voices and laughter. As he peered out his window, his blood ran cold. Megan had invited several friends over for an impromptu pool party on his property. The sight of her lounging in his pool, surrounded by her friends, was enough to send Jack storming outside. "Get out of my pool, Megan!" he shouted, his voice shaking with frustration. "Oh, come on," Megan laughed. "It's just a pool party. You're being dramatic." He wasn't. After all, this was his private property, and no one had permission to trespass. The confrontation became heated, but Jack kept his cool, despite the boiling anger inside. "I'm calling the police next time," he warned her, before turning to walk back inside, his heart pounding. Things only got worse. Over the next few weeks, Megan's actions became more brazen. She would hang around his yard late at night, staring at his windows, and even went so far as to climb over his fence one evening when he was out, leaving a trail of footprints around his pool. That was when Jack decided to take action. He installed security cameras all around the property, every angle covered, every inch of the fence and yard monitored. Jack had learned from his years in law enforcement that the best way to protect yourself was through documentation. And Megan, it seemed, was going to give him plenty of material. It wasn't long before Jack had the evidence he needed. One night, as he watched the footage, his jaw tightened when he saw Megan trespassing again. This time with a bucket of pool chemicals. She was tampering with his pool, poisoning the water with something that could only be described as sabotage. That was the moment Jack realized he couldn't let this go. But instead of confronting her, he devised a plan to make her regret ever messing with him. The key to Jack's plan lay in an innocuous but brilliant idea he had overheard at work, using a harmless pool dye that reacts with certain chemicals found in expensive sunscreens. The dye would turn the water a bright green, but only for those who had been in the pool wearing certain brands of lotion. It was harmless, temporary, and, most importantly, absolutely humiliating. Jack made sure to test the dye first, using his neighbor's sunscreen that he'd found by the poolside. The results were perfect. It turned the water a shocking green, and when he tested it on a small patch of fabric, it stuck. Even better, it would stay on the skin for days. The stage was set. Megan, with her high-maintenance friends and their designer sun lotions, was planning another pool party for the weekend. Jack made sure to keep his distance. He pretended to leave for the day, but instead, he parked around the corner and walked back to his home office, keeping an eye on everything through his phone. By 2 p.m., Megan and her friends arrived. They were ready for a day of sunbathing, gossip, and what they thought, relaxing in Jack's pristine pool. One by one, they lathered on their sunscreen and dove in, completely unaware of the chemical reaction that was slowly starting to unfold. It didn't take long. First, one of the women, Karen, noticed the green tinge on her skin. Megan? Is my arm turning green? Megan laughed it off at first, thinking it was a trick of the light. But when the entire group started looking down at their now emerald skin, panic set in. They screamed, scrambling to get out of the pool, but the damage was done. The water was completely green, and thanks to Jack's hidden cameras, he had every moment documented. The video went viral within hours. The internet exploded with memes, comments, and hashtags. Green with envy was trending. Local news stations picked up the story. Even Megan's real estate agency couldn't escape the backlash. Their social media pages were flooded with angry comments, and the video spread like wildfire, eventually making its way to every corner of the city. But the most satisfying part? Megan tried to do damage control by posting a tearful video, claiming the whole thing was an accident. But all anyone could focus on was her face, still tinted a bright green under the camera lights. It didn't take long before Megan's reputation was irreparably damaged. She tried to explain herself to neighbors, but the damage was done. Her attempt to sabotage Jack's life only led to her own downfall. Jack, on the other hand, couldn't help but smile. His quiet, peaceful life had been restored, and his small victory became a neighborhood legend. People who had once kept their heads down now began to stand up for what was right. Jack had unintentionally united the neighborhood by standing his ground against an entitled neighbor who thought she could get away with anything. And as for Megan, well, she eventually moved away. The green tint had faded from her skin, but the stain on her reputation would last forever. Her new neighbors would soon learn the truth as well, and the cycle would likely repeat. But Jack was just fine. He continued to enjoy his backyard, surrounded by friendly faces and the sweet sound of children's laughter. After all, sometimes the best revenge isn't about taking matters into your own hands. It's about letting life do it for you. Jack's backyard remained a sanctuary, the soft murmur of laughter from his friends and family creating a sense of peace that had been hard to come by in the weeks leading up to Megan's downfall. With the endless flow of support from his neighbors, it was clear to him that community had a way of protecting its own, even from the most entitled of individuals. But life, as it often does, had a way of throwing new challenges his way. Several months after Megan had moved, the neighborhood had started to settle into a new rhythm. There were fewer complaints, fewer whispered conversations when Jack passed by. In fact, his little neighborhood had never been more tight-knit. The block parties were bigger, the lawnmowers a little quieter, and there was a renewed sense of camaraderie that hadn't been there before. Jack even found himself looking out over his backyard with more peace than he'd had in years, feeling grateful that the worst was behind him. Then, out of nowhere, a new neighbor moved in. Mark and Emily Thornton, young, ambitious, and newly engaged, had bought the house 2 doors down. They were a breath of fresh air, or so it seemed at first. Friendly, polite, eager to fit in, they quickly became regulars at the weekend BBQs and community events. But Jack had learned his lessons well. He knew that appearances weren't always as they seemed, especially after his experience with Megan. A few weeks passed, and everything seemed perfectly normal. Emily started working from home, and Mark was frequently out at his job in finance. Jack thought nothing of it until he started to notice something strange. The Thorns were always perfectly immaculate. Their lawn was freshly mowed, their mailbox spotless, and their fence line untouched. Too untouched, if you ask Jack. One evening, as Jack sat on his porch enjoying a cold beer, he spotted Mark outside, bent down near the fence, acting a bit too discreet. Jack couldn't put his finger on it, but there was something off. His instincts kicked in. Maybe it was just the way Mark kept glancing over his shoulder, or the way he disappeared back inside as quickly as he'd appeared. The next day, Jack received an anonymous letter. It was handwritten, the ink slightly smudged, but the message was loud and clear. You should really watch your backyard. The thorns are up to something strange. Jack wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but this had all the hallmarks of something familiar. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to be part of another drama, and for the second time in his life, it seemed that karma was getting ready to deliver another dose of justice, whether he liked it or not. To prepare, Jack did what he knew best. He turned on his cameras. What happened next would shake the quiet neighborhood to its core. In the dead of night, Jack watched on his phone as Mark and Emily snuck into his yard. This time, not just acting strangely, but tampering with his fence. Mark was cutting the wires, and Emily, of all things, was busy setting up what looked like surveillance equipment right on the edge of his property line. Jack froze, his eyes glued to the screen. His gut twisted. This was no ordinary curiosity, he realized. They were spying on him. Not wanting to make a hasty move, Jack decided to bide his time. He continued to watch their every move, analyzing their patterns. It didn't take long for him to realize that they were more than just curious. They were trying to gather dirt on him, perhaps hoping to get some leverage for a later game. One night, Jack made his move. He called in a few of his closest friends for backup and started installing his own set of surveillance cameras, right on his fence line, capturing every angle of the Thorns' backyard. A few days later, he'd gathered enough footage. It was as he suspected. The Thorns weren't just spying. They were trying to frame him for something he didn't even know was happening. They'd planted trash in his yard, had recorded false incidents involving his property, and even fabricated stories of suspicious activity. All of it was set to make him appear like a nuisance, a threat to the community. The details of their plot were clear. With the evidence now in hand, Jack knew the next step. The time for passive observation was over. He did what he did best. He made a public scene. At the next HOA meeting, Jack stood up, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a quiet intensity. He had the footage queued up, the entire neighborhood watching as he projected the evidence of the Thorns' deceit. Their lies were exposed for what they were. An attempt to destroy Jack's reputation, to manipulate the community into thinking he was a danger, and ultimately to push him out. Mark and Emily's faces went ashen as the footage played out in front of everyone. Mark tried to interrupt, but the truth was out there now. The neighbors, who had once been uncertain, found their voices, this time rallying around Jack. A few even came forward with stories of strange behavior they'd witnessed in the past weeks, from odd conversations with the Thorns to seeing them sneak around at odd hours. By the time Jack finished his statement, the room was dead silent. The Thorns, unable to defend their actions, left in disgrace, their future in the neighborhood uncertain. The following week, for sale signs appeared in front of Mark and Emily's house. Once again, karma had found its way to the uninvited, and it had delivered justice in a way that no one could have anticipated. Jack, though, found his peace. His backyard remained a place of comfort, and his community, united by truth and shared experiences, was stronger than ever. He realized that sometimes, the best way to handle adversity wasn't to strike back directly, but to let the truth unravel on its own. And as for the neighbors who had stood by him, they now understood that when you take a stand for what's right, the community stands with you. Jack smiled to himself as the neighborhood celebrated another block party. Some things never change, and that, he thought, was the best revenge of all. And as for Mark and Emily, well, they left quietly, but they left with one final lesson. Sometimes, it's better to be a good neighbor than to try and deceive the ones around you. Just like Megan before them, they learned the hard way that karma, as Jack had learned years ago, always has a way of finding its target. And this time, it had hit them square in the heart. If you've ever had a neighbor like Megan or Mark, how did you handle the situation? Do you believe in the power of karma? Or do you think taking matters into your own hands is the way to go? Drop a comment below with your thoughts, and don't forget to hit that like button if you enjoyed the story. Make sure to subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable tales of karma, revenge, and neighborly drama. You won't want to miss what's coming next.